What if the past we think we know is only a carefully edited version of reality, polished, restructured, and stripped of inconvenient truths? The idea of Tartaria, or the so-called Lost Empire of Tartary, invites us to ask precisely that question. It begins with an almost cinematic premise, an advanced civilization stretching across Eurasia, its borders so immense that old maps once labeled the entire northern expanse of Asia with a single word, Tartaria. And yet, in the history, books handed down through schools and encyclopedias, Tartaria has all but vanished, reduced to a cartographic curiosity. The deeper puzzle, however, is the Mudflood hypothesis, the claim that cities across the globe were once swallowed in a sudden deluge of mud, hiding entire floors of buildings and erasing the material traces of this mysterious empire. This is not a casual story spun in a campfire circle. The Mudflood narrative presents a challenge to the authority of academic history itself. Walk through the old districts of St. Petersburg, Paris, or even San Francisco, and one can indeed find windows peering oddly out from beneath street level, or grand arched doorways sunken into the ground as if the earth itself had risen against them. Mainstream historians explain such anomalies as the result of road-raising projects, shifting soil, or urban redevelopment. Yet alternative researchers point to them as scars left by a forgotten global event. The mainstream fact is clear. Enough, Tartary, or Tartaria, did exist as a geographical designation in European maps between the 16th and 19th centuries, encompassing Siberia, Mongolia, and Central Asia. It was never a unified state, but rather a term that lumped together the wide lands occupied by various Turkic and Mongolic peoples. The quirky tidbit, however, is that as late as 1771, Encyclopaedia Britannica included Tartary as a massive region in Asia, only for the same reference work to erase the entry in subsequent editions, a vanishing act that fuels suspicion. Historians still argue whether this editorial disappearance was simply a matter of geographical refinement or evidence of a deliberate rewriting of history. The Mudflood enters this discussion like a ghost at the feast. The claim is that sometime in the 18th or 19th century, an inexplicable deluge of mud swept across continents, burying buildings, suffocating populations, and wiping out Tartaria itself. Imagine elegant boulevards suddenly reduced to swamp, cathedrals sunk halfway into the ground, and vast cities left deserted. In the conspiracy-tinged corners of the internet, photographs of half-buried doorways and sunken arches are presented as courtroom exhibits for this lost catastrophe. Skeptics dismiss the Mudflood as little more than pareidolia applied to architecture, our human tendency to find meaning where there is none. A sunken window might be nothing more than the byproduct of 200 years of road construction, layered upon itself like geological strata. Yet the sheer number of such examples, from Warsaw to Chicago, from Istanbul to Melbourne, creates an unsettling sense of pattern. Could so many cities across continents share the same oddity merely by coincidence? At the heart of this enigma lies the human desire for hidden knowledge. If Tartaria was real, and if it was erased, who benefited from its erasure? Was this a case of victors writing history, of empires like Britain and Russia sweeping aside inconvenient rivals? Or is it an allegory projected backward, a modern conspiracy theory stitched together from fragments of urban archaeology, fueled by internet forums and YouTube documentaries? One cannot help but notice how the Mudflood theory resonates with deeper myths. Civilizations swallowed by disaster are as old as storytelling itself. Atlantis sunk beneath the sea, Pompeii buried under ash, Sodom engulfed by fire. These tales echo through centuries, shaping our imagination of sudden endings. The Mudflood seems to update that motif, shifting the setting from mythic antiquity to the far more recent 19th century, and suggesting not divine wrath, but a systemic cover-up. Historians face a paradox here. To dismiss Tartaria as a pure invention risks overlooking the genuine historical roots of the term, which did represent entire cultures once feared and respected in Europe. Yet to embrace the Mudflood wholesale risks stepping into pseudo-history, where speculation runs faster than evidence. And so the debate continues, suspended between the provable and the possible, Between architectural quirks and apocalyptic visions, as we embark on this journey through the vanished landscapes of Tartaria and the muddy footprints it allegedly left behind, the essential questions remain open. Why did maps once label a region so vast, only for the name to vanish almost overnight? Why do countless buildings across continents display the same eerie half-buried look? And why does the Mudflood hypothesis continue to draw thousands of believers? Despite the absence of a single stratigraphic layer of global mud, perhaps the true story of Tartaria is less about what was and more about what we want to believe could have been. Still, the allure of a forgotten empire, drowned in mud and memory, remains irresistible. In the previous section, we traced the hook of Tartaria's enigma, the Mudflood hypothesis, and its eerie architectural clues. Before the question of catastrophe can be fully engaged, however, we must ask how the idea of Tartaria entered the historical record in the first place. For centuries, the very word Tartaria occupied a bold presence on maps, in encyclopedias, and in travel chronicles. Its sudden disappearance from mainstream references provides the first mystery in this unfolding tale. The mainstream fact is straightforward. During the 16th to 18th centuries, European cartographers frequently labeled Northern Asia as Great Tartary. This term covered an immense region stretching from the Caspian Sea through Siberia all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was not a single nation, but a convenient blanket label for lands inhabited by Mongolic, Turkic, and Tungusic peoples, many of whom were semi-nomadic. To Western eyes, this vast expanse was poorly understood, a wilderness beyond the known frontiers of Muscovy and China. Yet, here lies the quirky tidbit. Early editions of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1771, carried an entry for Tartary, describing it as a massive region of Asia, with subdivisions such as Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, and Russian Tartary. But by the mid-19th century, the very same encyclopedia had scrubbed Tartary from its pages, as if the region had never been named so. This editorial erasure lends fuel to conspiracy theorists, who argue that history was not merely evolving, but being deliberately rewritten. Historians still argue whether this was simply a matter of refinement in geographical terminology, or whether something deeper was at play, an intentional effort to obscure. What is undeniable is the fascination Tartaria held for early modern chroniclers. Jesuit missionaries sent back reports of Tartars living in formidable cities with unusual architecture. European travelers described wooden fortresses, rich textiles, and advanced horsemanship. The very name, Tartar, became entangled with fearsome legends, as Mongol invasions had centuries earlier swept across Europe, leaving scars that lingered in cultural memory. Even Shakespeare could invoke the Tartars as shorthand for barbarian hordes, yet there was ambiguity even then. Were these Tartars Mongols, Turks, Persians, or some entirely different people? European chroniclers often blurred distinctions, lumping entire ethnic mosaics into one amorphous category. This vagueness is precisely what Mudflood theorists exploit. If Tartaria could mean many things, then perhaps it could also signify a hidden, advanced civilization. Consider maps produced by cartographers like Gerardus Mercator or Abraham Ortelius. In some, Tartaria sprawls across nearly a third of Asia, dwarfing Russia and China. In others, smaller labels subdivide it, but the term itself dominates. To modern eyes, this suggests a recognized cultural zone. Yet historians explain it as a reflection of European ignorance, mapmakers filling blank spaces with a convenient umbrella term. Still, the visual impact of those maps is striking. Tartaria appears as if it were an empire equal to Rome or China. Then there are the chronicles. Marco Polo, though often accused of embellishment, described parts of Central Asia and Mongolia that would later be categorized as Tartaria. Later travelers added details of exotic customs and monumental structures. By the 18th century, however, exploration and empire building by Russia and Britain began to absorb these lands into more familiar categories. Siberia became Russian. Xinjiang became Chinese. The grand name Tartary was quietly retired. Why? Does this matter? Because to those who suspect suppression, the timing looks suspicious. The 18th and 19th centuries were also when the industrial revolutions, colonial empires, and scientific historiography emerged. To weave a new narrative of progress, perhaps it was convenient to erase older, ambiguous entities that did not fit. The modern map. Imagine, what if the sudden erasure of Tartary coincided not only with imperial expansion, but also with the aftermath of a disaster, the Mudflood, that demanded a fresh rewriting of history? Skeptics push back. They argue that changing map labels is no more sinister than dropping Gaul or Christendom from common usage. Names evolve as borders shift. To them, the case is closed. Tartary was not an empire, only a placeholder. And yet, every old map hanging in a dusty archive whispers otherwise. One intriguing element is how Tartary sometimes appeared alongside unusual iconography. Certain maps showed fantastical creatures roaming its borders. Some engravings depicted Tartars living in tent cities under star-shaped fortresses. Were these embellishments or faint echoes of genuine architectural marvels now linked to Mudflood theory? Historians still argue whether such star forts were purely military innovations of European powers or evidence of a shared architectural legacy that spanned continents. Thus, before we ever reach questions of buried cities and hidden floors, the stage is set. Tartaria was not invented in internet forums. It was once a real label, widely used, deeply feared, and then swiftly erased. Its disappearance created a void. Into that void, speculation rushed. Perhaps Tartaria was more than a name. Perhaps it was a civilization silenced by catastrophe, buried under mud and under the edits of cartographers. And so the map becomes a battlefield. On one side stand mainstream historians, pointing to semantics and evolving geography. On the other, alternative researchers, holding up those old charts like courtroom exhibits, insisting that the past has been whitewashed. Between them lies a tantalizing possibility that history is not a stable text, but a palimpsest, scraped clean, rewritten, and hiding older layers just beneath the surface. Asterisk. In the last section, we trace the origins of Tartaria as a concept through maps and chronicles, watching it expand across Eurasia and then vanish from the cartographic record. That disappearance sets the stage for the most controversial layer of the narrative, the Mudflood hypothesis. If Tartaria was not merely a word but the shadow of a real civilization, then perhaps the reason it is absent from modern history is because it was physically erased, swallowed up in mud, buried beneath our very streets. The mainstream fact here is practical. Many cities built in the 17th to 19th centuries indeed show what appear to be buried ground floors. Walk through St. Petersburg, Moscow, Warsaw, or even cities as far away as San Francisco and Melbourne, and one can find windows opening directly into soil or grand arched doorways now sunken below street level. Urban historians explain this through a variety of factors: streets raised over centuries to improve drainage, construction debris accumulating and raising ground level, or simple settlement of buildings into unstable soil. These are real, measurable processes confirmed by geology and urban planning. Yet the quirky tidbit is that photographs from the 19th century often show newly constructed buildings already appearing buried. Visitors to St. Petersburg in the early 1800s commented on how much of the city seemed to sit oddly low in the ground, as if it had been partially swallowed. Skeptics of the Mudflood theory suggest these were simply misperceptions or artifacts of incomplete urban leveling. Believers, however, see them as direct proof. A catastrophic event had swept through recently, and architects built atop the remains. Historians still argue whether such anomalies are merely infrastructural quirks or clues of something more extraordinary. The Mudflood narrative spins out from these buried doorways into a global event. Proponents argue that sometime between the mid-18th and mid-19th centuries, a deluge of mud engulfed cities across continents. It was not a local landslide, not a single flood, but a sudden worldwide catastrophe. Picture an entire neighborhood waking one morning to find the first story of their homes gone, drowned under brown earth. The story insists that populations perished in great numbers, that whole cities were depopulated, and that what remained was handed to new settlers, orphans, migrants, or colonists, who inherited buildings they never built. Critics dismiss this outright. There is no geological record, they insist, of such a recent, global-scale catastrophe. No stratigraphic layer of mud has been identified. No written record from government archives describes such an event sweeping across Europe, Asia, and the Americas simultaneously. Yet here the debate sharpens. Mudflood proponents counter that written records may have been deliberately suppressed, and that physical evidence is in plain sight. The so-called submerged architecture. Consider the classic example, St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, an enormous structure completed in 1858. Photographs show it standing on a raised platform, with what appear to be buried windows beneath. Officially, these are basement ventilation shafts or substructures for stability. But mudflood. Theorists claim they are remnants of an older building, partially consumed by mud before being repurposed. Similar claims are made for the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, the Chicago World's Fair buildings of 1893, and countless municipal halls in Europe. One of the strangest elements in the narrative is its proposed timing. Unlike Atlantis, which is set thousands of years ago, the mudflood is alleged to have occurred scarcely 200 years ago, within the reach of photography and modern record-keeping. This closeness is what makes it so provocative. If true, it would mean our entire modern world is built on a lie, and that an advanced empire like Tartaria was erased not in mythical prehistory, but in the very century that birthed modern nation-states. The lack of physical evidence, of course, remains the stumbling block. Geologists note that mud flows can indeed devastate entire regions, volcanic lahars, glacial outbursts, or tsunamis leaving silt. But these leave distinct signatures in the earth. The absence of such a worldwide stratum in recent centuries speaks loudly against the theory. Still, anomalies invite attention. For example, the 1812 Caracas earthquake reportedly produced floods of mud in urban areas, swallowing homes. In Lisbon, survivors of the 1755 earthquake described earth liquefying and consuming entire streets. Could a series of such events, scattered worldwide, have been stitched together into the image of a single mudflood? Historians still argue whether the mudflood is best understood as a metaphor. Perhaps it is not literally about mud, but about the burying of history beneath layers of interpretation. After all, cities do bury their pasts, sometimes quite literally. Archaeologists digging under London or Rome constantly uncover older streets beneath the modern level. In some places, entire neighborhoods have been abandoned, filled, or paved over. Could the mudflood be an allegory misread as catastrophe? A dramatic narrative woven from the mundane fact that civilizations continuously build upon their own ruins? Yet, there is something undeniably haunting in the imagery. Buried windows staring like blind eyes from beneath sidewalks. Stairways leading down into dirt. Cathedral doors accessible only by descending steps when they were clearly built for level entry. These anomalies, scattered across continents, whisper of an event that mainstream history has no ready category for. And this is precisely why the mudflood hypothesis refuses to die. Whether one sees it as literal catastrophe, metaphorical concealment, or fringe fantasy, it raises a deeper question about how we read the evidence of the past. Do we trust the official explanations that tuck anomalies into neat boxes? Or do we allow ourselves to entertain the unsettling possibility that something enormous has been hidden in plain sight? If Tartaria was the empire erased, then the mudflood is the eraser itself, silent, shapeless, but devastating. In the next layer of our investigation, we must look not only at mud but at stone, the architecture that stands today as silent witness. For in the grand facades and peculiar star-shaped fortresses, believers see the clearest fingerprints of a world we were never meant to inherit. In the last section, we explored the mudflood hypothesis, the claim that an inexplicable deluge of mud swallowed entire cities, leaving behind buildings half-buried and memories erased. But even if we set aside the mud for a moment, the stones themselves seem to speak. Architecture is, after all, a civilization's handwriting. And in the case of Tartaria, that handwriting appears everywhere, etched into walls, carved into arches, and most mysteriously, embedded in fortresses shaped like stars. If Tartaria existed, then its most enduring survivors are not written records, but buildings. The mainstream fact is that much of 18th to 19th century architecture, particularly in Europe and the Americas, follows the grand neoclassical style. Columns, domes, and arches were copied from Rome and Greece as symbols of power and order. Cities such as St. Petersburg, Paris, and Washington, D.C. were built in this style to project authority. Yet, the quirky tidbit is how frequently these buildings display anomalies. Massive doorways far taller than any human needs, staircases leading down into what appear to be buried entrances, and subterranean windows that suggest a floor hidden below street level. Historians still argue whether these are mere quirks of design, products of later reconstruction, or faint fingerprints of something older. Consider the so-called giant doors. Walk into many European palaces or civic halls, and you find doorways 20 feet tall, fitted with doors that seem absurdly large for human scale. Architects explain these as aesthetic choices, monumental design to awe visitors, to make the individual feel small before the state. But Mudflood theorists whisper another interpretation. Were these doors built for beings taller than us? Or were they repurposed from a prior civilization that operated on different proportions? The image of giants striding through those doors lingers, unsettling and provocative. Then there are the windows, half buried, peering up from the soil like eyes gasping for air. In St. Petersburg, entire blocks of buildings show ground-level windows opening directly into Earth. Explanations abound: raised roads, snow protection basements, gradual buildup of urban debris. Yet when the pattern repeats across continents, in Warsaw, Paris, Boston, Melbourne, it challenges coincidence. Could so many unrelated cities share the same architectural mystery by chance alone? Most striking of all are the star forts. These massive fortifications, built in intricate geometric shapes, dot the globe. From India to Italy, from Japan to the Caribbean, they follow nearly identical layouts, pointed bastions, interlocking angles, and moats designed to deflect cannon fire. Military historians argue that they are Renaissance innovations, introduced in Italy and spread globally by European empires. But alternative researchers insist there is something too perfect, too universal about them. How did cultures separated by oceans produce forts that look as if stamped from the same blueprint? Were these truly just military defenses or energy harnessing structures, remnants of Tartarian technology disguised as fortresses? This brings us to another peculiar feature: domes and spires. From the onion domes of Moscow to the Capitol Dome in Washington, these rounded crowns dominate skylines. To engineers, they are feats of masonry and aesthetics. To Mudflood believers, they are resonant devices, antennae for channeling free energy from the ether, technologies misunderstood and then repurposed as symbols of religion or state. The very lightning rods atop so many domes are reinterpreted not as safety features, but as remnants of a lost electrical grid. Historians still argue whether such interpretations are creative misreadings or glimpses of suppressed knowledge. Skeptics note that humans everywhere converge on similar architectural solutions because they solve the same problems: defense, shelter, or grandeur. A star fort is efficient at deflecting cannon fire. A dome distributes weight evenly. But believers counter that the sheer scale, uniformity, and unexplained anomalies suggest more. Architecture also raises unsettling questions about construction speed. Accounts of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair describe vast neoclassical white city structures allegedly built in less than 2 years, only to be demolished immediately after. Skeptics of official history ask, how could such colossal, ornate buildings be erected so quickly with 19th century technology? Were they, in fact, remnants of an older civilization, cleaned, decorated, and presented as temporary exhibitions? Before being destroyed to hide their origins, even in smaller details, mysteries persist. Why do so many buildings feature bricked-up windows, sometimes entire rows of them? The official explanation is the window tax imposed in parts of Europe, leading owners to seal windows to reduce taxes. Yet in the Mudflood narrative, these sealed portals were once open and functional, until rising earth swallowed them, forcing builders to brick them over. Architecture, then, becomes a battleground of interpretation. To the historian, it is the story of style, utility, and politics. To the Mudflood theorist, it is forensic evidence, silent testimony of a catastrophe scrubbed from the record. And in the middle stands the casual observer, drawn in by the oddity of a door too tall, a window half buried, a fortress shaped like a star. If Tartaria's chronicles are gone, perhaps intentionally erased, then its architecture may be its last surviving script. But buildings alone cannot tell the whole story. What of the people who lived, or perhaps repopulate, those cities after the supposed mudflood? For the next layer of this mystery, we must look to one of the strangest episodes in 19th century history, the sudden mass movement of children across continents, the so-called orphan trains, and how they intertwine with the narrative of a civilization reset. Asterisk. In the previous section, we listened to the stones themselves, grand arches, buried windows, and star-shaped fortresses that seem to whisper of a vanished civilization. But architecture does not live without people. And herein lies one of the strangest intersections between mainstream history and the Tartarian mudflood narrative. The sudden appearance of orphan trains in the 19th century, moving thousands of children across continents. To believers in hidden history, these were not simply humanitarian efforts, but population resets. Evidence that the survivors of Tartaria were replaced with new inhabitants. The mainstream fact is clear enough. Between 1854 and 1929 in the United States, more than 200,000 children were relocated by rail from crowded eastern cities to rural homes in the Midwest and beyond. Known as the orphan trains, this social experiment was organized by charitable institutions like the Children's Aid Society to ease urban poverty, reduce crime, and provide families for abandoned or impoverished youth. Many of these children went on to live ordinary lives in farming communities. Similar programs occurred in Britain, which shipped orphans to colonies like Australia and Canada. Yet the quirky tidbit is how eerily this coincides with the period when the mudflood is said to have taken place. At the very moment entire architectural districts looked suspiciously depopulated, trains full of children were dispatched to repopulate lands that, in some theories, had lost their original inhabitants. Historians still argue whether this was simply coincidence, charities acting in response to industrial poverty, or whether it reveals a deeper effort to seed empty cities with fresh populations. The orphan train narrative fits neatly into mudflood lore. Proponents argue that the so-called orphans were in fact the children of those who perished in the catastrophe, or perhaps wards left behind when whole adult populations disappeared. If true, this would explain the eerie absence of detailed personal histories among many relocated children. They appeared, quite literally, out of nowhere, tagged with numbers, distributed like parcels, and absorbed into communities. Critics of the theory push back firmly. There is ample documentation of urban poverty, disease, and neglect in 19th century cities like New York, London, and Paris. Child abandonment was a tragic but real phenomenon, worsened by waves of immigration and inadequate welfare systems. Orphan relocation programs, though often harsh, were responses to these conditions, not evidence of a hidden cataclysm. Still, the optics of thousands of children arriving in strange towns, with little record of their origins, fuel suspicion. One detail often emphasized is the sheer scale. In some photographs, groups of children line up in neat rows, hundreds at a time, waiting to be selected by rural families. To believers, this resembles not charity but redistribution, moving human populations around like game pieces on a board. The sense of a reset grows sharper when one notes how many orphan train destinations coincided with regions that mudflood theorists claim were once Tartarian centers. Beyond America, echoes appear. In Britain, child migrants were sent overseas, under government programs that lasted well into the 20th century. Canada, Australia, and South Africa received tens of thousands of children, many of whom suffered exploitation. To the mudflood narrative, this global shuffling of orphans was not simply imperial social engineering, but part of a larger cover-up, repopulating lands emptied by disaster. The imagery here is potent. Imagine walking into a grand, half-buried city where first floors stare up from the mud, streets are eerily quiet, and buildings seem older than the settlers who now occupy them. Into this emptiness arrive trains full of children, new voices echoing through empty hallways, laughter filling abandoned neighborhoods. Was this a humanitarian act, or the quiet reseeding of civilization after an unspoken catastrophe. Mainstream historians continue to emphasize the social crises of the era: cholera, tuberculosis, slum conditions, and industrial accidents that orphaned thousands. Yet even they admit that the scale of relocation was staggering and the fates of many children went unrecorded. This absence of detailed personal narratives makes the conspiracy easy to graft. Where there is silence, imagination rushes in. What makes this angle so compelling is how neatly it links human experience with architectural anomaly. The half-buried buildings suggest cities disrupted. The sudden influx of orphans suggests a replacement population. Put together, they form a story of reset, a world turned upside down, then carefully repopulate, its original inhabitants erased from memory. And this idea of repopulation echoes older myths. After the biblical flood, Noah's family replenished the earth. After the destruction of Atlantis, survivors supposedly seeded Egypt and Mesopotamia. If the Mudflood erased Tartaria, then perhaps the orphan trains were its Noah's Ark, delivering the next generation into emptied lands. Still, no geologic core sample, no definitive historical document proves such a cataclysm. Historians still argue whether the orphan trains were simply pragmatic responses to industrial misery or evidence of something far stranger. Yet the uncanny alignment of timeline, imagery, and silence ensures the Mudflood orphan link will not fade easily, but children and families are only one thread. What about the technologies said to have vanished with Tartaria? Buildings with domes and spires suggest not just shelter, but power, energy drawn from the ether, resonance shaping matter. If population resets hint at cultural erasure, the story of forgotten technology hints at something even more audacious: that Tartaria may have been an advanced civilization, wielding tools beyond what we imagine, only for them to be buried along with its history. The deeper one looks at the Tartaria mystery, the more the stones and stories begin to point towards something extraordinary. Hints of technologies that should not have existed in the 18th or 19th century. Architecture alone carries strange whispers. Domes crowned with spires resembling antennae, towers with intricate metallic tips, and star-shaped forts aligned with mathematical precision. To believers, these are not merely decorative or defensive features, but remnants of an advanced energy system, often called antiqui tech, that was silenced along with Tartaria itself. That a mainstream fact anchors this discussion. Lightning rods became widely used in the late 18th century, introduced by Benjamin Franklin to protect buildings from strikes. Domes and spires were therefore crowned with metal rods connected by cables to safely channel electricity into the ground. The official purpose is clear: safety, not energy generation. But here enters the quirky tidbit: many old buildings bear multiple rods and ornate metallic devices that go far beyond simple protection. Some resemble tuning forks, others elaborate crowns of metal latticework. To Mudflood theorists, these were not safeguards but collectors, tapping into a natural electrical field to provide free energy. Historians still argue whether such details were purely stylistic flourishes, misunderstood technologies, or fragments of a lost science. Free energy theories often point to Nikola Tesla, whose experiments in wireless transmission during the late 19th century briefly suggested the possibility of global electricity without wires. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, built in 1901, was a massive structure designed to transmit power through the Earth and atmosphere. While mainstream accounts describe Tesla as a visionary who ran out of funding, Mudflood believers place him as a rediscoverer, not an inventor, someone who tapped into knowledge once wielded by Tartaria. Resonance plays a central role in this interpretation. Domes, spires, and star forts are seen as resonant structures, capable of amplifying natural frequencies in the earth and air. Cathedrals, with their cavernous interiors, so perfect for carrying sound, are reinterpreted as vibrational devices, acoustic power plants rather than just places of worship. The massive pipe organs within them, some argue, were not simply for music but machines designed to tune frequency, vibrating air and matter alike. That a peculiar example often cited is the Exposition buildings of the 19th century. The Chicago World's Fair in 1893 featured towering neoclassical halls, crowned with domes and lit by what appeared to be brilliant electric lamps. Official history attributes this to the triumph of Edison's electric light. Yet alternative, researchers ask, how were such immense structures, supposedly temporary, built so quickly and wired so effectively? Could they have been inherited Tartarian structures, fitted with rediscovered energy systems for display, then demolished to hide their true origins? The theme of suppression shadows this discussion. If Tartaria had indeed discovered a way to harness energy directly from the environment, it would challenge the foundations of industrial society. Coal, oil, and later centralized electricity grids would no longer be necessary. Believers claim this is why such technologies were buried. Powerful interests could not allow an economy of abundance when profit relied on scarcity. In this light, the Mudflood was not only a natural or accidental disaster, but an intentional erasure of a system that threatened empire and capital alike. Skeptics, however, point to the lack of tangible artifacts. No functioning antiqui tech machines have been recovered. No hidden blueprints confirm free energy towers. Domes and spires, they argue, are aesthetic choices, drawing on symbolic associations with heaven and authority. Cathedrals are built to glorify God, not to vibrate molecules. And yet, the uncanny similarity of these structures across cultures, Moscow's onion domes, Indian temples crowned with spires, European capitals capped with rotundas, continues to spark curiosity. An especially puzzling motif is the worldwide presence of star forts. Their geometry is not only militarily useful, but also resonates with theories of energy grids. Some researchers suggest they were nodes in a vast power network, arranged across continents in patterns matching ley lines or geomagnetic flows. Whether designed for defense, ceremony, or power, their mathematical precision remains awe-inspiring. Historians still argue whether these interpretations are imaginative overreach or intuitive glimpses at a lost science. Mainstream accounts emphasize technological progress as a steady, documented climb: steam, telegraph, electricity. Mudflood theorists instead imagine a fall. Humanity once had wireless power, resonance technologies, and sustainable abundance, but it was erased, leaving us to rediscover fragments under the guise of modern invention. The silence of artifacts fuels the mystery. Buildings stand, their domes and spires intact, but their supposed machines are missing. Some claim these devices were dismantled, melted down, or hidden in vaults. Others believe the machines themselves are still in plain sight, disguised as architectural ornamentation. To walk through a cathedral, past bristling pipes and gilded domes, is for some to walk inside the hollowed-out husk of a machine whose true function we no longer understand. The image is tantalizing, a world powered without wires, lit by ambient energy, resonating with music that was both art and science. A civilization that built star-shaped cities and crowned them with shimmering domes, not only as symbols, but as functional components of a planetary grid. If this was Tartaria's legacy, then the Mudflood did more than bury walls. It silenced a frequency, leaving us deaf to a resonance that once hummed through the air. Yet even as architecture and alleged technology whisper of hidden powers, another layer of the mystery beckons. If a catastrophe erased Tartaria, what kind of catastrophe could leave such global marks while sparing the continuity of nation-states? To approach this, we must turn to the great intellectual clash of the 19th century, Catastrophism versus uniformitarianism. The battle over whether history is written by sudden disasters or the slow grinding of time. Ideas of forgotten technologies and silent architecture naturally invite a deeper question. If Tartaria was erased, how exactly could an entire civilization vanish so suddenly? The debate over this point is not limited to fringe history. For centuries, scholars and scientists have argued over the very mechanism by which Earth and history change, through sudden catastrophe or through slow, gradual processes. This is the intellectual battlefield where the Mudflood theory tries to plant its flag. The mainstream fact is that by the early 19th century, geology had embraced uniformitarianism, the principle that the same gradual processes shaping the Earth. Today, erosion, sedimentation, tectonic drift also shaped it in the past. Popularized by Charles Lyell in his Principles of Geology, 1830s. This view insisted that no great catastrophes were needed to explain landscapes. Rivers carved valleys, seas laid down layers, glaciers ground mountains, all over immense spans of time. The quirky tidbit, however, is that uniformitarianism was not always dominant. Earlier thinkers, such as Georges Cuvier, argued for catastrophism, that sudden floods, upheavals, or cosmic events had repeatedly reshaped the Earth and extinguished entire species. Cuvier himself believed the fossil record showed repeated annihilations followed by fresh creations. Historians still argue whether the shift to uniformitarianism was a purely scientific triumph or a cultural choice, an attempt to align natural history with Enlightenment ideals of order, stability, and predictability. In this tension, the mudflood theory finds a fertile home. If cities across the world do indeed show signs of being buried, catastrophism provides a framework, a sudden global event, perhaps seismic or atmospheric, sweeping through and leaving devastation in its wake. Mud surging through streets, swallowing doorways, silencing civilizations. This imagery fits Cuvier better than Lyell. Modern geology complicates the picture. While uniformitarianism remains the bedrock principle, evidence has revived catastrophic thinking. The discovery that an asteroid impact ended the age of dinosaurs is one famous case. Megafloods carved canyons in North America at the end of the Ice Age. Volcanic eruptions like Tambora in 1815 threw the world into a year without summer. These events remind us that history is punctuated by shocks as well as by gradual shifts. Could the mudflood have been such a shock, compressed into the fragile framework of the 18th or 19th century? Advocates suggest causes ranging from massive earthquakes liquefying soil to atmospheric skyfall, events dumping mud across continents. Others speculate about electromagnetic disruptions or planetary alignments, borrowing from fringe cosmology. Skeptics counter that no uniform stratum of mud exists worldwide from this period, no undeniable geological signature to anchor the theory, and yet the idea lingers. When one stands before a buried window or a sunken door, the imagination resists gradual explanations. Road raising? Soil settling? Yes, perhaps. But what if it was faster? What if people went to bed one night and awoke to find the first floor of their homes drowned in earth? That unsettling possibility makes the mudflood both haunting and oddly plausible. Despite the lack of direct evidence, the debate between catastrophism and uniformitarianism is more than academic. It reflects how humans understand their place in time. Gradualism reassures us. The world changes slowly, predictably, within human control. Catastrophism unsettles us. Everything can vanish in an instant, no matter how advanced, no matter how stable. To place Tartaria on the catastrophist side of this spectrum is to insist that history is fragile and that civilizations can be swept away like sand castles in the tide. Historians still argue whether catastrophism's revival in recent decades is evidence of science self-correcting or of culture re-embracing mythic archetypes of floods and fires. Either way, the mudflood narrative bridges the two. It claims a recent catastrophe, denied by official science, yet visible in plain sight. If the battle between gradualism and disaster sets the intellectual stage, then the question turns to geography. Where, exactly, was Tartaria located, and how could such a vast entity vanish from history? To answer, one must journey into the heart of Central Asia and Siberia, where the lines between historical empire and forgotten myth begin to blur. Asterisk maps that once carried the label Tartaria stretched it across the frozen expanse of Siberia, down into Central Asia, and in some depictions even toward the Caspian and the edges of Persia. The territory was vast, a canvas painted with vague names: Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. For centuries, Europeans described it as a land of steppe horsemen, enigmatic tribes, and unreachable fortresses. To understand how Tartaria could disappear, one must trace the historical reality of those lands, and then weigh how that reality diverged from the myth that later blossomed. The mainstream fact is that these regions were not empty. They were the homelands of Mongolic and Turkic peoples, heirs of the Mongol Empire's fragmentation in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Khanates of Siberia, the steppe confederations of Central Asia, and later the expansion of the Russian Empire all occupied this territory. Cities like Samarkand and Bokhara were cultural centers, celebrated for Islamic scholarship and monumental architecture. By the 18th century, Russian conquest of Siberia and Chinese control of Xinjiang steadily erased Tartary as a useful cartographic category. Yet the quirky tidbit lies in how abruptly the word faded from maps and encyclopedias. A traveler in 1700 could still find Tartaria as a dominant name, covering a third of Asia. A student in 1850, by contrast, would find it gone, replaced by Siberia or Russian Empire. Historians still argue whether this was simply the inevitable precision of empire builders redrawing maps, or whether the erasure was unusually deliberate, signaling a desire to wipe out more than just a name. To believers in the Mudflood narrative, Siberia is ground zero. They point to accounts of immense cities in these lands, stone-built, ornate, and now absent. When Russian explorers pushed eastward in the 16th to 18th centuries, they reported fortified settlements and curious architecture, some abandoned. Yet in later retellings, these cities are minimized or forgotten. The story shifts. Siberia becomes a land of wilderness, its people primitive, its ruins dismissed as minor. Could these have been the last outposts of Tartaria, swallowed by mud and empire alike? Central Asia adds further intrigue. The Great Silk Road cities dazzled visitors with mosaics, domes, and minarets. To official history, these were Islamic centers of trade and learning. To Mudflood theorists, they are too similar in style too. The domes and spires of European capitals to be coincidence, perhaps all branches of one architectural tradition, fragments of a single civilization now labeled Tartaria. When seen through this lens, Samarkand's Registan Square and St. Petersburg's palaces are not opposites, but cousins. The timing of Russia's conquest deepened suspicion. The Siberian Khanate fell in the late 16th century. By the 18th century, Russian forts dotted the steppe. Whole populations were displaced, absorbed, or erased. Simultaneously, maps shed the term Tartaria. Was this a coincidence of empire building or the systematic elimination of a rival civilization's memory? Believers argue that Russia not only conquered the land but rewrote its past, presenting Siberia as wilderness to justify colonization, while hiding its true cultural wealth. Skeptics point to archaeology, no undeniable evidence of a vast unified Tartarian empire has been unearthed. The ruins that do exist, fortresses, steppe cities, burial mounds, fit comfortably within known Mongol and Turkic traditions. And yet, anomalies remain. Giant megalithic stones in Siberia, some say, are too large to have been quarried with known tools. Star-shaped forts appear on old Russian maps in remote regions where official history claims little settlement. Even Orthodox archaeologists admit Siberia's history is underexplored, its frozen soil still guarding secrets. The erasure of Tartaria from the record, then, may have been less about mud and more about power. If one empire swallows another, the memory of the vanquished often disappears. Rome absorbed the Etruscans. The Inca swallowed smaller Indian peoples. Russia and China, by the 19th century, had no reason to preserve Tartaria as a category. Its lands were annexed, its name unnecessary. But to those who peer through the gaps, the sudden disappearance feels unnatural, as if more than geography was erased. And so Siberia and Central Asia linger as ghostlands in this story. Whether as Mongol successor states, Silk Road kingdoms, or the imagined core of Tartaria, these regions embody the tension between myth and empire. The Mudflood theory places them at the center of catastrophe. Mainstream history folds them into the steady march of Russian and Chinese expansion. Between these narratives lies a fertile ambiguity, the space where forgotten civilizations are born, live in rumor, and die in silence. If the steppes and Siberian taiga provide the setting, then the next puzzle lies not in geography, but in spectacle. For in the late 19th century, colossal exhibitions appeared, showcasing monumental architecture that looked suspiciously like Tartarian remnants dressed up as temporary wonders. The world's fairs promised visions of progress, but to some eyes, they concealed something older, something borrowed, something never meant to survive. Toward the end of the 19th century, the world was dazzled by a series of enormous exhibitions that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The Paris Exposition of 1900, the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904, and most famously, the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893, all showcased grand avenues of palaces, domes, and gleaming colonnades. Officially, these were temporary marvels, built quickly in plaster and wood, then dismantled after the crowds departed. But to those who suspect a buried history, the fairs look more like hastily repurposed relics of a vanished civilization. One last glimpse of Tartaria before it was demolished, photographed, and forgotten. The mainstream fact is that these expositions were indeed monumental achievements of architecture and engineering, though constructed with the intent of impermanence. The White City of Chicago, for example, covered nearly 700 acres, lit by thousands of electric bulbs, with grand neoclassical facades designed to inspire awe. Architects like Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted planned them as both artistic triumphs and showcases of industrial progress. Contemporary accounts describe them as miracles of coordination, built in under 3 years and dismantled soon after. Yet the quirky tidbit is that many visitors reported the buildings as too solid, too detailed, too massive to have been erected so quickly. Columns rose dozens of feet in height, domes rivaled those of Europe's cathedrals, and the scale resembled Rome more than a temporary fairground. Mudflood theorists seize on this strangeness, suggesting these were not new constructions at all, but older structures, remnants of Tartarian architecture, whitewashed and presented as temporary wonders. Historians still argue whether skepticism of the construction timeline is fueled by underestimating 19th century industrial capability or by a genuine mismatch between official records and visual evidence. Photographs of the fairs add to the mystery. In many, the temporary, plaster buildings look indistinguishable from carved stone. Some appear weathered, as though older than the fair itself. After the exhibitions ended, many structures were burned, demolished, or abandoned. An odd fate for such monumental beauty. Why spend vast resources on artistry only to destroy it? The official explanation is practical. Temporary materials would not last, and maintaining them was costly. Believers counter, what if demolition was deliberate to erase structures that revealed too much of a forgotten architectural lineage? The Chicago Exposition is the centerpiece of this suspicion. Nicknamed the White City, it featured enormous domes, colonnades, and lagoons, illuminated by electric lights that astounded visitors. Tesla and Westinghouse famously supplied the current, proving the viability of alternating current electricity. To mainstream historians, this was modernity's triumph. To Tartaria theorists, it was proof that free energy systems, perhaps inherited from earlier technologies, were being disguised as novel inventions. The exposition becomes, in this view, less a celebration of progress and more a cover story. A final display before destruction. Paris in 1900 added more fuel. The Exposition Universelle featured monumental glass and iron pavilions, electric displays, and enormous gates that looked more like ancient triumphal arches than modern constructions. While official history points to the era's engineering boom, alternative researchers note the eerie resemblance to supposedly Tartarian styles. Domes, arches, intricate ornamentation, spread across continents. Was this truly the work of 19th century architects or recycled grandeur from an older civilization? Another puzzle is the speed with which these expositions vanished. In St. Louis, many of the palaces were burned or dismantled within a year of the fair. In Chicago, only a handful of structures survived, and those heavily altered. The rest disappeared as if they had never existed, leaving only photographs as testimony. Believers ask, why erase them so completely, if not to sever ties to a deeper, older source? Skeptics counter with a practical truth. Plaster, wood, and staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber, were never intended to endure. They looked grand but were fragile, easily destroyed by weather and fire. The fact that they were built so quickly is explained by industrial efficiency and mass labor, not hidden inheritance. Yet even skeptics admit the aesthetic power of the White City and its cousins. These fairs were designed to overwhelm, to create a sense of timelessness, to place the visitor inside a living dream of civilization. Historians still argue whether the expositions represent the peak of 19th century optimism or a curious waste of effort on fleeting spectacles. In the alternative telling, they are neither peak nor waste, but camouflage, giant stage sets hiding truths. If Tartaria once stood, then the world's fairs were its requiem, a final parade of domes and arches, crowned in electric light, before bulldozers and fire consigned them to oblivion. And what if these destructions were not isolated? For scattered across the same century are countless urban infernos, great fires that swept through London, Chicago, San Francisco, Moscow, and more. Official records call them accidents, disasters of wood and flame. The Mudflood narrative asks, or were they acts of erasure, finishing what catastrophe began? Asterisk across the 19th century, flames seemed to stalk the great cities of the world. London in 1861, Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, Moscow in 1812, San Francisco in 1906. Each great fire left vast swaths of urban landscape reduced to ash. Officially, these were accidents compounded by dense wooden housing, poor fire brigades, and the spread of sparks in tightly packed neighborhoods. Yet to those attuned to the Tartaria and Mudflood narrative, these fires were not simply misfortunes of growing cities. They were resets, mechanisms to erase the remnants of an older architecture, finishing the work that mud and silence had left incomplete. The mainstream fact is straightforward. Urban fires were devastatingly common in the 19th century because industrial cities grew faster than safety systems. Streets were crowded with wooden tenements, oil lamps lit the night, and chimney maintenance was poor. Once a fire began, especially in dry and windy conditions, it could race unchecked across entire districts. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, for example, destroyed more than 17,000 structures and left over 100,000 people homeless. Its official cause is still debated. Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocking over a lantern became a popular myth, though never confirmed. Yet the quirky tidbit is how frequently these fires struck just as cities were transitioning into modern stone and brick architecture. Many of the districts burned down were immediately rebuilt in grand neoclassical style, often with buildings bearing suspiciously monumental proportions, columns, domes, and buried floors. To Mudflood theorists, this sequence looks orchestrated. Fires clearing away old Tartarian structures, paving the way for new facades that could be passed off as products of the industrial age. Historians still argue whether this reconstruction boom was simply progress or part of a larger pattern of erasure. San Francisco provides a particularly provocative case. The earthquake of 1906 sparked fires that raged for 3 days, destroying 80% of the city. Officially, this was a tragic but natural consequence of seismic instability and wooden construction. But photographs taken after the disaster show stone and brick buildings gutted by fire, yet still standing with strange resilience. Some appear half-buried, with windows staring up from beneath the new ground level. Believers ask, were these the remnants of an older civilization erased under the guise of disaster recovery? Moscow's fire of 1812, occurring during Napoleon's invasion, is another puzzle. More than 3/4 of the city was consumed. Official accounts attribute it to Russian troops setting fires to deprive Napoleon of resources. Yet in the Mudflood narrative, it becomes another convenient inferno, clearing away layers of older architecture. The rebuilt Moscow gleamed with neoclassical facades that to some eyes bear the same Tartarian signature as Paris, St. Petersburg, or Chicago. Patterns of timing intensify suspicion. Fires often struck just before or after major expositions, wars, or urban renewals. The Great Chicago Fire, for example, preceded the 1893 World's Fair, whose White City arose on cleared land. San Francisco's fire paved the way for a new downtown aligned with modern banking and commerce. To skeptics, these are coincidences explained by the pace of industrial growth. To believers, they are orchestrated resets, strategic erasures. Disguised as misfortune, And then there is the curious recurrence of natural disaster plus fire. Earthquakes in Lisbon, 1755, and San Francisco, 1906. Urban blazes in Chicago and Boston, bombardments in Moscow and Paris, all not only destroyed, but provided a pretext to rebuild. In the Mudflood framework, these events are not random. They are moments when the slate is wiped clean, when inconvenient remnants of Tartaria are buried under rubble, fire, and reconstruction. Historians still argue whether the sheer number of urban catastrophes in the 19th century reflects poor infrastructure or deeper systemic forces. There is no denying, however, that each fire rewrote the memory of its city. Old districts vanished, replaced with grander, more modern facades. Archives and records burned, leaving gaps. Populations shifted as homeless families relocated or orphans were sent to new homes. In the silence left by fire, conspiracy thrives. The imagery is stark. Cities in flames, their skies orange and black, cathedrals half-buried, yet smoldering, and new boulevards rising where ash still lay. To the mainstream eye, this is the story of urban growth through tragedy. To the alternative view, it is the story of erasure by design, the finishing stroke to a global catastrophe begun in mud. If great fires served to obscure Tartaria's remnants, then who wielded the matches? Who benefited from the slate wiped clean? The trail of suspicion leads not just to natural causes, but to human hands. Empires with motives, rulers with ambitions, and states eager to consolidate power. And so the shadow of Tartaria stretches into politics, where Romanovs, the British Empire, and their allies stand accused of rewriting history itself. Asterisk, whenever a civilization vanishes from the record, one must ask, who had the power to erase it, and who benefited from its absence? If Tartaria truly represented an advanced, expansive empire scattered across Eurasia, then its disappearance coincided suspiciously with the rise of two powerful forces in the 18th and 19th centuries: the Romanov dynasty of Russia and the global reach of the British Empire. Together, they redrew the world's maps, restructured its narratives, and in the process, may have buried a rival civilization beneath layers of smoke, mud, and ink. The mainstream fact is undeniable. By the 18th century, Russia was expanding eastward with remarkable speed. The Romanovs consolidated power, absorbing Siberia, the steppe khanates, and eventually pushing into Central Asia. Britain, for its part, extended its colonial grip across India, the Middle East, and eventually towards Central Asia as part of the great game of imperial rivalry. Both empires needed clear categories of geography and ethnicity to manage their domains. Tartary, vague and sprawling, no longer served that purpose. By the late 19th century, maps instead bore the precision of Siberia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, or Xinjiang. Yet the quirky tidbit is how abrupt this reclassification was. Encyclopedias that once described Tartary as a vast and populous region quietly dropped the entry. School textbooks omitted it. Maps replaced it with new borders, often without explanation. Historians still argue whether this shift was simply the natural product of empire building or whether something more deliberate was afoot. The active rewriting of history to eliminate traces of an inconvenient rival. For Mudflood theorists, the Romanovs loom especially large. Russia's imperial expansion is seen not merely as conquest, but as cover-up. If Siberia and Central Asia contained remnants of Tartarian cities, technologies, and peoples, then Russia's integration of the region was a chance to recast its story. Accounts of ruins or advanced architecture could be reframed as primitive or ignored. Populations could be displaced, their identities redefined. The memory of Tartaria could be rewritten as wilderness tamed by Moscow. The British Empire, meanwhile, played a subtler role. In its colonial surveys and geographical studies, Britain redrew maps of Central Asia, often in rivalry with Russia. British chroniclers described regions as barbarous or undeveloped, despite encountering monumental architecture along caravan routes. The Islamic monuments of Samarkand and Bokhara were admired but framed as exotic relics, not as part of a broader Eurasian legacy. To believers, this was another act of erasure, reducing Tartaria to fragments, denying its unity, and ensuring that imperial powers held the narrative. Even within Europe, archives sometimes burned at suspicious moments. Fires in libraries, wars that destroyed records, and political upheavals created gaps in historical continuity. Believers argue these were not coincidences but coordinated acts of forgetting, erasing the written testimony of Tartaria even as the Romanovs and the British mapped the land to their advantage. Skeptics, of course, point to the sheer messiness of the 19th century, war, fire, and poor archival practices as simpler explanations. Yet the silence remains fertile ground for speculation. Another element complicates the story: Russia's relationship to architecture. St. Petersburg, built in the early 18th century under Peter the Great, rose with astonishing grandeur, filled with domes, columns, and palaces that to some eyes look far older than their official construction dates. Could this be a city not entirely built anew, but partly inherited? Mudflood theorists suggest that Russia presented these structures as its own triumphs, when in fact they were rebranded Tartarian legacies. Historians still argue whether the Romanovs' vast building projects represent genuine European-inspired modernization or the appropriation of an older, indigenous tradition now forgotten. The truth may lie somewhere between. Imported styles layered onto local foundations, creating hybrid architectures that confuse the historical record. But in the lens of conspiracy, this hybridization becomes theft, stealing not only land but legacy. The politics of erasure matter because they extend the mudflood beyond geology or architecture into human intention. If fires and floods can be explained away, the rewriting of maps and the silence of encyclopedias hint at deliberate choice. Someone decided not to preserve the name Tartaria. Someone promoted new categories instead. Whether accidental or strategic, the effect was the same. A civilization once labeled, then erased, and yet fragments survive, not in official documents, but in whispers, stories, and folk traditions. If empires buried Tartaria with ink and conquest, then perhaps its truest echoes live in folklore, in tales of giants, hidden cities, and lands lost beneath the soil. Those stories are our next destination, for they remind us that history is not only written in books but sung in memory, where forgotten empires can endure far longer than maps allow. Long after maps were redrawn by the Romanovs and the British Empire, whispers of lost empires survived not in textbooks, but in the memories of people. Folklore often outlives politics, carrying echoes of events that official history erases. In the case of Tartaria, fragments of myth and oral tradition preserve images of giants, buried cities, and strange technologies, stories that sound fantastical, yet fit uncannily with the architectural anomalies and mudflood theories already explored. The mainstream fact is that oral traditions across Central Asia and Siberia are filled with tales of buried kingdoms and ancient rulers. In Mongolia, legends speak of hidden cities beneath the steppe, guarded by spirits. Siberian folklore includes stories of great floods sweeping entire settlements away, leaving only scattered stones behind. Indigenous Yakut and Buryat traditions recall ancestors who once lived in grand houses of stone before being forced into yurts and wooden huts by Catastrophe. Though historians attribute these tales to myth-making and symbolic storytelling, they demonstrate that the memory of sudden upheaval is deeply ingrained in the region, that a quirky tidbit emerges when comparing these myths globally. In Europe, folk tales tell of churches sinking into the earth overnight, bells still tolling faintly underground. In the American Midwest, settlers recorded native legends of vast cities swallowed by mud. Even in Japan, myths of earth rivers describe waves of soil flowing across the land. To mudflood believers, such stories are not mere metaphor, but fragmented memories of a global event. Historians still argue whether cross-cultural flood myths point to archetypal human fears or to distant echoes of real catastrophes. Folklore also contains striking motifs of strange people or giants inhabiting the earth before modern humanity. The massive doors and windows of neoclassical buildings, often interpreted as Tartarian architecture, find their counterpart in folk legends of a taller race who once walked the land. Many cultures, from the Norse Jotnar to the Central Asian Urginican tales, feature giants as fallen rulers, displaced by current humanity. Could these motifs be symbolic retellings of past cultural dominance? Or do they serve as allegorical explanations for oversized architecture that puzzled local storytellers? Memory persists not only in tales, but in ritual. Festivals in Central Asia celebrate the building of enormous bonfires to ward off disasters, echoes of fires that once consumed cities. Songs speak of cities turned to earth, metaphors perhaps for conquest, but also uncannily resonant with Mudflood imagery. Even lullabies preserve fragments of cosmology, lines about the earth shaking, rivers of dirt flowing, or ancestors buried deep underground. Skeptics note that such myths are nearly universal. Floods, fires, and giants appear in traditions from Mesopotamia to the Americas. They argue these arise from the shared human experience of natural disaster and the imaginative need to explain ruins. But believers point to the consistency of detail, buried architecture, swallowed cities, hidden bells, giant doors. When folk stories mirror physical anomalies, the boundary between myth and suppressed history grows thin. Historians still argue whether oral traditions can be treated as historical evidence or as poetic memory. Yet the persistence of Tartarian echoes in folklore highlights a central truth. Even if empires are erased from maps, they continue to live in stories. And those stories are resilient. They outlast dynasties, wars, and even deliberate attempts at erasure. In this sense, folklore functions as a counterhistory. It refuses to accept the silence imposed by imperial archives. It keeps alive the possibility of other worlds, other powers, other endings. For Tartaria, it provides a parallel narrative. Not the wilderness described by Russian conquerors, but a land of palaces, cities, and catastrophe. Whether real or imagined, this memory endures because it answers a deep human longing, the sense that the world once held mysteries now lost. But in the modern age, folklore alone is no longer enough. The stories of hidden empires have migrated into new arenas, forums, videos, digital archives, where they meet fact, speculation, and entertainment. The revival of Tartaria in the 21st century is not the work of shamans or elders, but of algorithms, images, and the peculiar culture of the internet. Legends once carried by storytellers at firesides now travel at the speed of fiber optics. The resurgence of Tartaria in the 21st century is not primarily the work of academic historians or folklorists. It is the product of YouTube channels, TikTok snippets, online forums, and image boards. What began as scattered architectural oddities and obscure encyclopedia entries has become a sprawling digital movement, where fringe interpretations collide with legitimate historical anomalies. The mainstream fact is that digital platforms have democratized history. Archival maps, once hidden in libraries, are now freely accessible online. Old photographs of buried windows or grand expositions can be shared instantly. Social media has made it possible for ordinary users to point out patterns across continents, half-buried buildings in Paris, Boston, or Melbourne that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. This easy access fuels new interpretations, both rigorous and speculative. The quirky tidbit is how quickly Tartaria has become a meme. Videos with millions of views ask, what if Tartaria was the world's lost empire? And offer montages of star forts, domes, and orphans on trains. Internet users remix these into music videos, animated explainers, even ironic memes featuring Tartarian free energy. A theory once confined to dusty corners of alternative publishing now thrives as entertainment. Historians still argue whether such viral content represents genuine curiosity about history or simply the internet's love of spectacle. Pseudo-history flourishes in this environment because it blends mystery with imagery. A photograph of a buried window requires little explanation. It is instantly unsettling. Pair it with dramatic music, and it becomes evidence. Algorithms reward this kind of compelling visual content, spreading it far beyond traditional conspiracy circles. The line between investigation and performance blurs. Some creators present the Mudflood as plausible research, others lean into irony, joking about antiquity tech antennas while still feeding the fascination at the same time. The digital age provides tools for serious exploration. Online archives of 18th and 19th century maps allow users to compare editions, tracing the sudden disappearance of Tartary as a geographic label. Enthusiasts pore over satellite images to locate star forts, cataloging them globally. Forums collate architectural photographs into vast databases, where users debate whether a buried doorway is evidence of road raising or a lost flood. The community dynamic itself mimics scientific discourse, crowdsourced peer review, but without the restraints of academic methodology. Skeptics and academics often find themselves frustrated. To them, pseudo-history on the internet spreads faster than corrections. A historian may carefully explain the economic causes of orphan trains or the practical reasons for star-shaped forts, but such explanations rarely go viral. The emotional appeal of a lost empire is far stronger. Historians still argue whether their role should be to actively counter such narratives or to let them circulate as harmless curiosity. What makes Tartaria unique among digital myths is its blend of plausibility and wonder. Unlike Atlantis, set in mythic prehistory, Tartaria is alleged to have existed just 2 centuries ago, close enough for photographs to exist, but far enough for ambiguity to creep in. The digital age thrives on such ambiguity. Grainy black and white photos, outdated maps, and architectural oddities provide perfect material for interpretation, remix, and debate. The result is a paradox. On one hand, the spread of Tartaria online represents the erosion of trust in official narratives. People question why encyclopedias changed, why buildings look half-buried, why fires recurred so often. On the other hand, it also represents a deep human fascination with story. Whether or not one believes in mudfloods, the imagery of lost empires captivates precisely because it feels like history with the volume turned up, grand, tragic, mysterious. Thus, Tartaria in the digital age is less about proving or disproving and more about participating. To share a photograph of a buried window with the caption "Mudflood" is to join a global chorus of curiosity. To create a video montage of star forts is to add another verse to the song. Fact and fringe meet in this space, not because one absorbs the other, but because the internet thrives on hybridity, on blurred lines. And yet, this raises a deeper question. Why does the idea of a lost empire resonate so powerfully today? Why, in an age of satellites, archives, and endless data, do millions long for the possibility that something vast and hidden lies just beneath the surface? To answer, one must leave the realm of facts and enter the realm of psychology, culture, and spirit. The persistence of Tartaria is not only about mud and maps, it is about us. The fascination with Tartaria is not merely about maps, mud, or architecture. It is about longing. Human beings are drawn to stories of vanished worlds, whether Atlantis beneath the waves, El Dorado in the jungles, or Lemuria under the sea. These tales endure because they whisper that reality is larger than the textbooks tell us, that somewhere in the cracks of history lies a secret that might change everything. Tartaria, with its half-buried windows and erased name, simply provides the most recent stage for this timeless drama. A mainstream fact shows how enduring this impulse is. Since Plato described Atlantis in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues, the myth of a powerful civilization destroyed in a single day and night has persisted for over 2,000 years. Every culture seems to keep its own version. The flood of Gilgamesh, the sunken bells of European churches, the ghost cities of Chinese folklore. These stories provide a framework for imagining both disaster and renewal, reminding us that even greatness can vanish. The quirky tidbit is that fascination with lost civilizations often surges during periods of rapid change. In the late 19th century, when Tartaria supposedly disappeared, Western readers were also enthralled with Atlantis theories, spurred by Ignatius Donnelly's wildly popular 1882 book. In the mid-20th century, as UFO culture grew, the idea of Lemuria and ancient aliens took hold. Today, amid digital overload and political mistrust, Tartaria thrives online. Historians still argue whether this pattern shows cultural escapism during uncertainty or whether it reflects genuine unease with official narratives that feel incomplete. The psychological appeal is layered. Lost civilizations satisfy a hunger for wonder. the sense that there is still mystery in a world mapped by satellites. They satisfy a hunger for justice. If Tartaria was erased, then perhaps history's victors are not as righteous as they claim. They also satisfy a hunger for identity. The thought that we might be heirs to something greater than modern nation-states, part of a forgotten lineage that on a cultural level, hidden empires provide a counterweight to the narrative of progress. Modern history often tells a story of linear advancement, from primitive ancestors to industrial triumphs. Myths of lost civilizations invert this. They suggest we are not the pinnacle but the survivors, building clumsily atop ruins of greater ancestors. The Mudflood, in this light, becomes a metaphor for our own amnesia, forgetting what we once were, struggling to recover fragments. Spiritual resonance plays its part as well. To imagine a buried empire is to imagine resurrection. Just as seeds sprout after fire, so too might truth reemerge after suppression. Tartaria becomes more than a theory. It becomes a parable about hidden light, about knowledge buried but not destroyed. For some, it aligns with mystical traditions that speak of cycles of ages, golden eras lost and to be regained. Historians still argue whether belief in lost civilizations is best explained by psychology, politics, or spirituality. Yet the persistence of these stories reveals something undeniable. We need them. They give voice to our unease with the incompleteness of recorded history, and they restore a sense of mystery to a world otherwise flattened by science and bureaucracy. Tartaria's allure is sharpened by its recency. Atlantis feels mythic, buried in antiquity. Tartaria, by contrast, feels almost within reach, an empire said to have collapsed just 200 years ago. That closeness tempts us to look harder at buildings, maps, and archives to believe that proof may still be found. It whispers that the world around us is not entirely what it seems, that the past lies just beneath our feet. And so the fascination endures, not because Tartaria is proven, but because Tartaria is possible. In every half-buried window, in every inexplicable star fort, in every blank space on an old map, the human imagination sees a doorway into something greater. The mystery is not only about them, it is about us, and our refusal to accept that the world has no more secrets left to tell. The last turn of this journey, then, is to return to the mystery itself, to gather the strands of mud, fire, empire, folklore, and digital rebirth. For whether Tartaria was real or imagined, erased or invented, its story forces us to confront the fragility of history, the power of narrative, and the hunger for worlds beyond our own asterisk, threading together Mudflood theories, orphan trains, vanished maps, colossal expositions, and the fires that consumed city after city. The idea of Tartaria refuses to collapse into a neat answer. It is a puzzle with missing pieces, a story whose silences are as loud as its evidence. Perhaps this is why it continues to captivate, not because it provides certainty, but because it withholds it, inviting endless speculation. The mainstream fact that cannot be ignored is that Tartary was indeed a term used for centuries to describe the vast Eurasian steppe. Its presence on maps and in encyclopedias is undeniable, and its disappearance in the 19th century is well documented. Official history sees this as a natural refinement, a move toward accuracy as Russia, China, and Britain tightened their grip on Central Asia. But the erasure leaves a vacuum, and vacuums draw stories. One quirky tidbit remains lodged in that vacuum: the peculiar architecture scattered across continents, with doors far too tall, windows half buried, and star-shaped fortresses replicated across oceans. These anomalies, innocent in isolation, collectively invite suspicion. They feel like the fingerprints of something larger. Historians still argue whether they are quirks of urban planning or fragments of a deeper past, but their presence keeps the mystery alive. If Tartaria's disappearance was only a matter of cartographic housekeeping, why do so many cultural echoes of floods, giants, and vanished cities align with its timeline? If orphan trains were only charitable programs, why do they coincide with the alleged reset of populations? If world's fairs were mere spectacles, why were their monumental palaces demolished so quickly, leaving only photographs behind? Each of these questions sits unresolved, and each draws new eyes to the theory. Skeptics insist that the Mudflood is an elaborate myth stitched together from coincidences and misunderstandings. Roads rise, soils settle, myths exaggerate. Fires, they argue, are tragedies of urban density, not conspiracies. And yet, for every explanation, another anomaly arises, another story that does not quite fit. The persistence of doubt may be the truest legacy of Tartaria. In this sense, the Mudflood hypothesis functions less as history than as allegory. It reminds us that the past is fragile, that empires can vanish, and that memory can be reshaped by those in power. It challenges the authority of official narratives, asking us to look again at the ground beneath our feet and the buildings above our heads. It suggests that history is not a finished text, but a palimpsest, written and rewritten, leaving traces beneath the ink. Whether Tartaria was a mighty empire or a phantom conjured by modern imagination, its endurance tells us something vital about ourselves. We crave mystery, we mistrust silence, and we seek in the ruins of the past a reflection of our own fragility. If an empire could vanish under mud, perhaps so too could ours. That thought is terrifying, but also strangely comforting. It places us within a larger cycle, where creation and erasure are both inevitable. And so the mystery endures. Perhaps Tartaria will never be proven, nor entirely dismissed. Perhaps its true home is not in textbooks, but in the space between folklore, conspiracy, and wonder, where questions matter more than answers, and where imagination refuses to accept the world as fully known. Let us now soften the pace. The fire of speculation cools, the floodwaters recede, and the maps roll back into silence. We leave behind the towering domes, the buried windows, the ghostly trains of orphans, and the star-shaped fortresses glimmering under forgotten suns. What remains is not certainty, but a mood, a gentle awareness that history is larger than we often allow it to be. Close your eyes and picture a city at dusk. The streets are quiet, the stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Perhaps some of those stones are older than we know, foundations from a time when names were different, when the world was measured in empires long since erased. Perhaps beneath the soil, another level waits, windows staring upward from the dark, stairs descending into silence. Breathe and feel how these images linger. They are not accusations, nor proofs, but invitations. Invitations to wonder, to ask, to remember that knowledge is never complete. The Mudflood, whether real or imagined, serves as a reminder. History has gaps, and into those gaps flow the stories we need, stories of resilience, of erasure, of possibility. Allow the tension to ease now. Let the voices of debate grow faint, like echoes in an abandoned hall. What remains is calm, a gentle recognition that mystery itself is part of being human. We do not need every answer to feel the presence of the past. We only need to listen, to the stones, to the stories, to the silence between. And as this journey comes to its end, imagine yourself walking away slowly, carrying not the weight of proof, but the lightness of wonder. History does not close, it only waits, patient, beneath the surface.